I was watching the thing on the new Apple Watch, and people like, and
Oh
then,
yeah, the double tap.
then I was at the airport and I was talking to this guy. He was like, I was
You
like,
saw him do the double tap
yeah,
in the airport?
yeah, because we were waiting to catch our flight, and he was asking me about my backpack, the one everybody asked me about.
Yeah.
So then we just started talking from there, and at some point he must have felt something. He was like, I was like, okay, that's pretty cool.
So welcome to the Tech Explained podcast. This podcast is designed to help you basically understand how to get the most out of technology, but also kind of break down tech news and help you understand what is it, why should you really care about it, and even just what it means for you in your everyday life. My name is Arthur. I am the host of the Tech Explained podcast, and I'm joined today by Brent Miller. Brent's going to be helping out with kind of just asking questions as the average consumer, helping you guys ask the questions that you may need explained. And then I will hopefully be diving deep into the topics that we're going to talk about. Today, we're going to talk about Apple's Scary Fast event that they just had the day before Halloween. So here's the interesting thing about this. I just want to kick this off. There's a couple of things I wanted to start off with. One, this is the first time that Apple's held an event at night. So this
wow.
actually happened at 8 p.m. Eastern time, which is the coast that we're on. And that's the first time that Apple has ever done that for any of their events. Usually their CEO, Tim Cook, comes out and says good morning to everyone.
Right.
And this time they kicked it off with a good evening because it was 5 p.m. They did a really good job with filming it. It was they filmed it at night.
Okay.
On their campus like they do with a lot of their previous events for the past couple of years. But it was really cool to see Apple doing something different. They went a little spooky with it in light of Halloween, which was really cool. And there was little things here and there that they did. One of the things I was disappointed in is no one came out in a costume.
Oh.
So no one was dressed up, but
That's kind of weird.
They still had the elements of Halloween there.
Right.
But we finally got a different intro line from their CEO, and then it just felt a little bit different. And then the other thing, and this goes all the way to the end of the event. So at the end of the event, they're showing the Apple logo as it's ending, and then they throw this little tagline at the end. And they say that this event was shot on an iPhone 15 Pro Max and edited on Mac. So the second part of that is not surprising. I'd be surprised if they edited on something other than Mac. But the fact that they shot the whole event on an iPhone 15 Pro Max, it still amazes me at the quality that you can get out of the iPhone camera. And I think Apple is trying to start to showcase that, especially since now they have more capability with the iPhone 15.
Right.
Because they changed the port. In fact, actually, this podcast is recorded on a 14 Pro Max, and then your angle is shot on an iPad. But we've done a lot of content together on iPhone,
Yes.
and we've, having the right equipment makes any camera look really good. I think that's the key to it. The thing that I've seen on social media recently since the event is that Apple's getting a lot of flack for using high production equipment, but just using their camera. But I think the thing that people forget about is the fact that when you use high production equipment, like lighting, mics, and things like that, you can get really good quality out of a camera. I think this podcast is evident of that. Any content that we've created in the past is evident of that. And I think it just proves that with the right equipment, you can really do a lot with it. So, but other than that, we can dive into the event. Any questions that you have for me?
So I would say the thing I think about between me and you and the age difference is billionaire Robert Smith said this. He said, millennials and below are digital natives. People that in my generation, baby boomers, are digital immigrants. This is all new to us. Yeah. And so I like that it's called Technology Explained.
Yeah.
Because for us, if I could text and answer a phone call, I'm good.
Yeah.
But because we've worked together and I've seen you do so many amazing things on your phone and your iPad, it just blows me away. So I'm looking forward to understanding why some of these features are something to be excited about. Because other than that, for me, it sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 wah.
I hear you.
So I greatly appreciate the opportunity for you to explain tech to me.
Of course, of course.
So what was explained in this? Because usually they do their events, what, yearly?
Yeah, so this one's a little bit different because at the beginning of this year, they had announced new MacBook Pros
Okay.
with their new, and they had already announced about a year ago the M2 processors. So this event was launching the next series of M processors, and the M processors are the ones that go inside of their Mac machines typically, or inside of some of their iPads.
Okay.
But they're based all on the same architecture that they used inside of the iPhone. It just has now gone. It has now gone to the Mac.
Right.
With Apple's really push to move to their own silicon and get away from Intel. So years ago, Apple decided that they were going to move away from Intel because Intel was just not satisfying Apple's needs in terms of boosting performance. And the first year that they did that, and I know both of us actually use their M1 computers.
Yes.
That M1 computer boosted the performance significantly over Intel.
Right.
And Apple's been toting that ever since. So now we're on the third generation of those processors, and that's the main thing that they started off the announcement with, is announcing the M3, the M3 Pro, and the M3 Max.
So let me ask you this. What is the chip equated to? Is it like the engine? Is it the, if you had to explain it to a digital immigrant, what is that chip for? What does it do?
So in most computers, this is the CPU. And the CPU basically is the engine that runs everything, or the brain that runs everything. However, in Apple's computers, it does everything because they've included everything onto the chip. And it's because it uses a technology called ARM. And ARM-based chips are basically everything built into the same package. Whereas on what's known as x86, or what Intel computers use,
Right.
Or even some even AMD computers, they have a CPU, which runs most of the brain function of the computer, but they also have dedicated functions like a GPU, and then their system memory, and then storage. Apple's encompasses almost all of those components into one chip, which is what they've been doing and what mobile phones have been doing for years, but now they're starting to bring that into computers. And what they're noticing since launching that into computers is that they're able to get more efficiency out of the computers, which means for a lot of people like yourself, you can get better battery life out of a computer.
Right.
And then sustained performance and longer performance over time.
Okay. And that's real interesting because you always hear this stuff.
Yeah.
And you think, what's the big deal? I just bought one last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. Why do I need to buy a new one? Because it still does everything I need.
Yeah.
But from what you're saying is it will improve the processes of what I'm doing and make it a lot quicker.
Yep. And the whole focus of the M3 processors, while they did boost the overall computing performance, the biggest boost that it's gaining is graphic performance, which for an everyday person could just mean that, you know, I can get better gaming performance if I'm interested in gaming on my computer. I can also just have more sustained performance over time with my computer. So as the operating system becomes more graphic intensive, which happens over time because as Apple or Microsoft design their operating systems to look nicer, that means that they're going to graphically take more on the processor.
Okay.
Which means that if I buy one of these computers, I can then look to have a computer that can last years because I'm probably not going to be hitting that headroom that someone who, like a creative or someone in an industry that actually is going to take a lot of advantage of that immediately, who might look at that and be like, I need to upgrade year over year, versus the average person maybe looks to upgrade between every 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
But that just means that they're going to have more of that headroom to go. And it's funny that you also bring that up because Apple definitely is pushing that agenda with this keynote. because they're really talking about here's how this computer and how these processors compare to our older computers. So they actually compared it to the performance of the computers that we've had.
Right.
And it's a nice jump in performance, even though I can tell you I've never really pushed the limit of my computers yet. So it's really nice to see that Apple is continuing to push the agenda. But they're also looking at if you have an older computer, like an older Mac with an Intel processor, here's the performance that you could get out of it.
Okay.
So that was the other thing that they had talked about during the event. But other than that, it was mainly focused on the M3 series of processors. And then they announced some new computers along with that.
So are they coming out with new MacBooks, MacBook Pros, or what are they coming out with?
Yep. So 3 new computers were announced. 2 of them are MacBook Pros. So you have an update to the 14-inch MacBook Pro and the 16-inch. So you get to pick based on size.
Right.
The biggest thing that happened with the 14 inches, there used to be a weird skew in the lineup, which was the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which had the touch bar, which was the last MacBook Pro that had the touch bar. It was actually the last Mac that had the touch bar. That computer is now no longer in the lineup. It's been replaced by a 14-inch MacBook Pro that has just the baseline M3 processor.
Okay.
So they've traded that out and put that into its place. So now users that are looking at the MacBook Pro lineup can see they can actually get the same design computer just with lesser power performance. But it's still a very powerful computer with the M3 processor, even not going to the M3 Pro. The other lineups allow you to get the M3 Pro or the M3 Max, depending on your configuration.
Right.
And then depending on how much RAM and storage you would want to add to the computers as well. And then the other computer they announced is an update to the 24-inch iMac. So they brought the 24-inch iMac. They didn't change anything in terms of components or its design. They just added the M3 processor to it. So now it goes from the M1 to the M3.
Okay.
And I'm just a little disappointed because they didn't add an M3 Pro into that option.
Right.
You can only get the iMac 24-inch in the M3. And I feel like at some point they're going to announce maybe an iMac Pro again, or maybe they won't.
And my question is, and you've helped me with this when I bought my Mac, I think last year.
Yeah.
There's MacBook Pro and a MacBook Air.
Yes.
What's the major difference? If I'm looking for a computer, and I know it kind of depends on what I'm going to do with it, what would a person that would pick a Pro, what would they kind of do versus an Air?
So if you're looking between the Air and the Pro, the biggest differences are going to be performance. Now, with the M series processors, performance is going to be great either way.
Okay.
But it's always going to depend on what are you needing the computer to do. And those are the things that I always ask people when I was selling computers, was helping understand what are some of the things that you're looking to do, what are some of the things that you might potentially be getting into. Because while a baseline MacBook Air is going to be fully capable of doing a lot of stuff, even light photo editing, video editing, because that M processor is really good.
Right.
If you really are going to start to push that agenda, you may want to consider going into the Pro.
Okay.
Either that or you reconfigure your MacBook Air. But it's really just a difference of battery life. So the MacBook Pros are thicker. They're going to be heavier, but it also means that you're going to get better battery life because the MacBook Pro has a bigger battery inside of it. And then with the MacBook Air, you're going to get a lighter computer that is capable of definitely sustaining performance. But the other major difference is the MacBook Pro has a fan built into it. The MacBook Airs don't. So they're very much like iPads in that sense, where they don't have a built-in fan. And that means that they can ramp up performance, but they're going to reach a point where they'll start to peak.
Okay.
And they just will start to throttle down the speeds just to be able to make sure that the MacBook is not overheating.
Okay.
So it'll do that. Whereas in comparison, the MacBook Pro will start to ramp up its fan so it can try to sustain the performance that you need it to. For most people, they won't notice that workload. They would have to really push the limit on a MacBook Air to be able to really notice a difference. And a lot of people
And
do
I'm gonna
that.
cut you off. What's push the limit? What would be pushing the limit?
Pushing the limit is there's a couple of different things. So it could be really intensive photo editing, audio mixing, video editing. I mean, it's all of that creative work that a lot of people get into with MacBook Pros. But it could also be, depending on the applications, let's say you're doing, like, you're an engineer and you're working in CAD and things like that.
Right.
You're really pushing the graphics capabilities of the computer. It could also be gaming. You're pushing the limits of the CPU and GPU in terms of gaming. But there are a number of applications, depending on what you're using the computer for, that would really start to push the limit on it. And it's really just about if your everyday workflow is just web browsing, word editing, maybe you might do some light video and photo work. A MacBook Air is fully capable of doing that. If you're more leaning to, that's where I do a lot of my work, is I do a lot of photo and video work. I dabble in, or I work in an industry where I do a lot of type of graphic intensive work.
Right.
Depending on the applications that you're using, you may want to consider jumping into a Pro. Just because it's going to handle those processes faster, which means it takes less time for your computer to do those things. And that's a big thing. Whereas on the MacBook Air, it's just going to take a little bit longer.
And in one of your previous videos, you talked about iPad for work. If we throw the iPad into this conversation, because some people say, hey, what makes it better to use an iPad or a MacBook? If I'm starting to get into the creative, I use CapCut a little bit to do some things. Would an iPad be good or the computer?
That's going to depend on, it's really like a personal preference thing. So the iPad, and I do a lot of creative work on iPad, but, and really I use my Mac for just basic work. Even though my Mac could be capable of doing all of the work that I need to do. But for the difference between iPad really is just with iPad, it's just a completely different way of doing things. And for some people, that could be in a more traditional sense. It actually can be more frustrating to use because there's a lot of different things that over the years I've had to learn to work around with iPad in comparison to maybe using a Mac, which is a more traditional computing, right? But for some people, the touch friendliness of iPad makes it more friendly for them. The other thing is that it's basically like having bigger versions of your phone apps inside of there. While you can do a lot of that inside of Mac nowadays, it's just, for some people, it's easier to just continuously touch and utilize those functions inside of there. So it's kind of a toss-up. It really just depends. The iPad is capable of doing a lot, and that kind of speaks to the interesting thing about the... so Apple announcing these processors also alludes to the iPad eventually is going to get an update with these processors too. So it begs the question, which processors are going to go in which iPad? If we follow along the traditional sense that Apple has done over the past couple of years, they're just going to put the M3, which is the entry-level processor, inside of the iPad Air lineup and the iPad Pro. But I think it's an opportunity, since Apple is trying to push the agenda more with iPad, that they put the Pro processor inside of there. And maybe they put it inside of the iPad Pro. Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't because it's going to overheat because the iPad's really thin. Maybe they do and figure out a way to keep it cool. And maybe it's not as powerful as the one inside of the MacBook Pro, but it's still a Pro processor. Because, I mean, on the iPhone 15, they just announced, or they rebranded the Pro model to have a Pro processor.
Excuse me. And so here's a question. Watch another one of your videos. Pencil. If I got a pencil and an iPad, why don't I just use pencil and paper?
That's a good question. For me, it's about having your notes with you all the time. And
Okay.
while you can bring a notebook with you all the time, the I don't have to go buy a new notebook
Right.
when I'm using an iPad with an Apple Pencil.
Okay.
I can just continuously, depending on the apps I'm using, I can just continuously keep adding pages to it. And then I can have better organization of those notes and things
Okay.
like that. So you get that same feel of using pen and paper, but it's all digital. And it's not, you could also look at it as the whole, I'm being more environmentally,
Right.
but that's not really what it's about. For a lot of people, it's really just about, I just like having all of my notes in one location. And then if I'm using apps that can cross between, then I can
Okay.
pull up my notes on Mac, I can pull up my notes on iPhone, and I just have them with me. So that's the other thing. So whether I take the iPad with me or I don't take it with me, I could still pull up the app and say, oh, here's the notes that I was writing. And then I
Because
can add to it.
it's always funny when I would see you pull out your pencil
Yeah.
and take notes.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, pen and paper works the same way, but like you said, the ability to pull up those notes from any device,
Yeah.
I think is a good selling point because a lot of people probably like me think, what do I need a pencil for? I'm already typing or electronic, but it just gives you that ability. And then can't you highlight and do some other
Oh,
things
yeah.
with the pencil?
You could do a lot of different things. So whether you're creative and you want to do drawing and illustration, you could do that with a lot of different apps. And a lot of the pencils allow you to do a lot of different types of textures and ways of actually drawing, or you could do just simple writing notes, things like that. That actually brings up a really good point. Apple just announced a new Apple Pencil. And I don't really understand why. It kind of confuses the lineup. The fact that there's a lineup of Apple Pencils also confuses me too.
Right.
So there's 3 Apple Pencils now. There's an Apple Pencil with USB-C, which is the newest Apple Pencil.
Okay.
It starts at $79, or it's $79. It's a little bit different. It kind of looks like a third-party Apple Pencil, like something you would find on Amazon for like $20.
Right.
But done Apple's way, so it looks a little bit nicer than those. I think the biggest thing that it loses is the ability to do pressure sensitivity. So you can't it can't recognize when you're pushing down harder, which is not really a huge deal, especially if you're just taking notes. And then there's the first generation Apple Pencil. This one has the old Lightning port. And it's $99. So it's more expensive than the one that they just announced. And I feel like it's only in the lineup because there's an iPad that still exists in Apple's new lineup that has the old Lightning connector. So that's that. And then there's a second generation Apple Pencil, which is the one that I use with my iPad Pro. And that one's $129.
Okay.
So, and that one has all of the fancy features about it. But yeah, for me, the Apple Pencil really just allows me to, I only use it for writing. I do a little bit of creative work with it, but mostly writing. And then for me, when it goes to the difference between typing my notes versus writing my notes, and I heard this somewhere a long time ago, I don't know where, but I've heard that taking notes by writing them out allows you to remember them better than typing out your notes or not taking any notes at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's something about writing that helps it stick.
It's just stick, yeah.
So here's the $64,000 question.
Okay.
There's always two sides to everything.
Yeah.
You had beta, you had VHS,
Yeah.
you had all these Mac, Android. What makes Mac kind of the go-to? Because I know you're a tech person,
Sure.
and I'm a little tech, but I love my Apple phone. I love my Apple Watch.
Yeah.
So what makes Apple more of the go-to versus Android? Is it marketing or is it functionality or a little bit of both?
It has nothing to do with what's the word I'm looking for? The
Functionality?
no, what my wife tells me all the time. The ability to customize
Okay.
It's definitely not customizability. People don't go to iPhone because of customizability. They definitely go to Android for that space. And I think that's where Android excels,
Okay.
is giving more freedom to be able to do that. I think people go to iPhone for a couple of different reasons. One of the main reasons is the ease of use. So Apple has strived to make their operating systems very easy to understand and use.
Right.
They try to keep it simple, and they don't try to overdo the whole operating system. And they have also methodically not changed that much over time. So when you go from one iPhone to the next iPhone, it doesn't feel that different.
Right.
Android has caught on a little bit with that, and they've started to do that very methodical updates where they're just adding little functions here and there, and they're not changing the way things look or changing the way that things are. But they've done enough of that in the past that some people have felt like it's too drastic. And it also
Okay.
changes with each manufacturer that you get, whereas there's only one manufacturer of iPhone. So the system and the phone are made by the same company. And that's the other big thing is I think a lot of people just like the whole stack of everything. So
Okay.
Apple controlling the whole vertical of everything, and allowing them, and I mean, they make their own processors, they make the operating system, they make the combine all of the components for the phone itself, and they fine tune their operate the software to work for the hardware.
Right.
And then the other thing that they've done, and Android started to really catch on recently, is making sure that your phones can get updates over time,
Okay.
which is important, and it adds more functionality and life to a phone that's several years old, which is really nice. But really, I think it's the ease of use for a lot of people as to why they have stuck with iPhone and why they continue to go to iPhone. And then the other thing, and this is a big thing, is the ecosystem. So iMessage grabs a lot of people. It is hard to switch away from iMessage
Yeah.
and go away from it and go to something else. I mean, I've used a couple of different messaging apps just to be able to message my wife, and figure out and get kind of same functionality that I can get out of iMessage. So that way it's easy to communicate with someone on Android and be cross-platform. Because when you're out there on Android, it is not the same. There are multiple applications for messaging. And while, some people on iPhone may use WhatsApp and then Facebook Messenger, they have one single app that they usually rely on for messaging.
Right.
And it's just text messages to Android users and then iMessage for everyone else.
Yeah.
And that's an ecosystem thing. And then when Apple grabs you and puts you into one of the, like we've talked about in our work, a sticky product like getting an Apple Watch or getting an iPad and then getting a Mac, and then all of a sudden you're getting stuck to their ecosystem, and you realize that there's a connection between all of them. And Apple has done that intentionally to make it easy for you to stay inside of the walled garden of Apple's ecosystem. And I think that's the other thing is when you're so deep into it and enveloped into it, you just continue to stay in it.
Yeah.
And they try to make sure that you feel at home there too. So
It's funny because I have a brother, and you know who you are. He had a BlackBerry until you could no longer use a BlackBerry.
yeah,
And he said his reason was, and this is probably why some people use Apple and some don't. He said their loop was too close knit.
yeah,
They were very restrictive, but from what I understand, it also prevents you from getting a lot of viruses because it's close knit. But then, like you said, with Android, people like the customization, but then it makes you susceptible to other things.
you're right. Yeah, yeah, and the other thing is just like because there's so many different manufacturers of Android devices, each Android version is different. Not every phone gets the same updates. Some phones will come to market and not even really receive any updates.
Oh, wow.
And there's so much segmentation with their updates and the devices out in the field. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Whereas with Apple, it's really straightforward. If you've reached a point where your phone isn't getting updates, it's probably because you have a much older iPhone. And you either just deal with the fact that you have an older iPhone, or you go and get a new iPhone. And they try to make it appealing by keeping some of the older lineup in the mix, so that way you can get something that feels more modern but is not the newest and greatest iPhone.
Okay.
So
my last question is updates.
yes.
You know, you get these, hey, your phone's available for upgrade. Update. I just updated last week.
Yeah.
Why sometime are there so many updates?
So recently, there's been a lot of security patches that Apple's been fixing. So Apple will get updates from people in the community or from their own internal teams, letting them know that there are security flaws inside of their operating system. And Apple's been working harder recently to be able to patch those faster. So they'll put out 0.01 updates or 0.1 updates. If it's a major update, it's usually like a 0.1 or a 0.2.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that there might be some functionality that comes in. So like recently, Apple just released iOS 17.1, and then they did the same with the Mac and then the iPad. What they did was they released some functions that were not, they did some security stuff, but they released some functions that were not put into the 17 update, but they had announced in the summer when they were talking about 17. So they put in some minor updates that they had been planning, and that's kind of how it's been working recently, is Apple will update the operating system overall from like 16 to 17, but then there's some features that lag behind. So they'll release them in later ones. Like they're starting to already test with developers 17.2. 17.2, back in June, they announced this. They announced 17, and one of the features was a new app called Journal, which allows you to basically document and use your phone or iPad or Mac as a journal.
Oh, wow.
And have a dedicated app built in for that. And it would actually collect like photos that you might have taken recently and say, hey, you could create a journal entry based on these photos that you've done, or something that you've done recently. Maybe you are using your Apple Watch and you just did a workout, and it just says, hey, you know, this could be something you write about. So instead of having to pay or download a free journal app, like you were talking about before,
Right.
Apple has, they're coming out with one. It was announced back in June. They've continued to push it off, and now they're starting to test it again with developers and seeing if it's ready. And it'll probably come out either the end of this year, or it'll come out early next year in 17.2. But those are usually the minor things that you'll see. The other things are if they feel like they've reached the point with something that they want to go ahead and put it into the system before maybe like next year, then they'll put in something. And they did that long time ago when they introduced Apple Music. That came out in, I think, iOS 8.4, which they could have waited until iOS 9, but they wanted to go ahead and get the ball rolling for that. So they'll do that periodically. But yeah, most of the time, those like 0.01 updates, those are security patches. And that's why I see a lot of news articles that say you should update your iPhone urgently, because what it means is like there's something that has been exploited in the system, and they found a way to patch that, to fix it. So they're trying to make sure that that doesn't affect the security of the iPhone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, whether you're a digital native or a digital immigrant, if you're used to Cliff Notes, Tech Explained is Cliff Notes for people that don't understand technology.
Yeah. Stay tuned for the next episode of Tech Explained. We'll be talking about something. We'll figure out what our next subject is going to be. We've definitely got some plans in the pipeline already. Appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. If you got all the way to this point in the show, please leave a like, comment, share the podcast. Love to get this out to more people. And stay tuned for the next episode.